Welcome to our presentation this evening, Spun Out, Watchdog Media Bites Lapdog Media, where we brought together 5 journalists to talk about the rising threats to public debate and political dissent, and what every citizen can do about them. My name is Doris Wise-Montrose, and I'm president of Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors. Before we kick off tonight, I'd like to thank all the co-sponsors who helped make this event a reality. One Jerusalem, the David Horowitz Freedom Center, and the San Fernando Valley Republican Club. I'd also like to acknowledge 5 people, my friends, who are responsible for making all of our events work. Hannah Klein-Donley, Tia Dobson, Jeff Marcus, Eileen Smolson, Brad Smolson. You met them all when you came in the door. At CJHS, our mission is to ensure that never again remains more than a mere slogan, and we insist that the last Holocaust imposes on all people of goodwill an obligation to prevent the next one. We work every day to fulfill these pledges and to counter the dual global campaigns to undermine Western freedoms and delegitimize the state of Israel. That means, on one hand, that CJHS works to produce accurate information so that citizens are empowered to counter the anti-American and anti-Israel myths that have become so pervasive. But to win on the battlefield of public argument, our weapons must include not only valuable ideas, but also the means to deliver them. CJHS constantly strives to innovate and protect new channels for dialogue. Defending pro-Israel, pro-Western, and pro-freedom ideas requires using every kind of new media at our disposal, from digital journalism to Twittering, and from blogging to crowdsourcing. It's not just that traditional mainstream media outlets often fail to provide accurate, timely, relevant information about hot-button issues like the Arab-Israeli conflict, although, as I expect we'll hear shortly, it's certainly that as well. It's also that today's new media landscape requires new ways of reaching and engaging citizens, which is why CJHS seeks to remain at the forefront of pro-American and pro-Israel digital activism. Unfortunately, the freedom to participate in this new landscape is under threat today, and with it, the promise of a new era of openness and accountability. Efforts are being made across the country on state and national levels to regulate the internet and to stifle bloggers. And so tonight's event brings these two strands together at the point where arguments and facts meet CJH's commitments to online activism. We have assembled a panel of digital journalists and bloggers. Each one is an expert in any number of fields, and each one has repeatedly scooped and out-analyzed the mainstream media in those areas. I'll let Omri Sering from the blog New Rhetoric do the detailed introductions, but I wanted to specifically thank him and our 4 other participants tonight. Jim Hoff from Gateway Pundit, J.E. Dyer from The Optimistic Conservative, Daniel Greenfield from Sultan Knish, and Rick Richmond from Jewish Current Issues. And of course, I would like to thank all of you in the audience today who braved the wasteland of the 405 to come out tonight and participate in these discussions. After the panelists are done with their remarks, we'll do a question and answer, though our time tonight is short and we've got an enormous amount of information to cover. To keep things moving, we'll use 3x5 index cards to take your questions and comments, and we will be circulating to pick them up and deliver them to the front. On that note, I just want to make an announcement. The Jewish Journal is live streaming tonight's event, and a recording will be available after the event at jewishjournal.com. On that note, I'd like to thank everyone again and turn things over to tonight's panel.
Good evening, everyone. I'd also like to add my thanks to the ones that Doris gave, specifically to thank her and all the CJHS staff. She does a ton of work from morning to night to organize these events, to make sure that they run smoothly, and so I'd like to thank her again. I'd also like to thank all of our co-sponsors, my fellow panelists, you, the audience as well. It is a bit of a trek to come out here, and our city officials, county officials, and national officials have not made the drive the easiest for you, and thank you again for coming out. As I said, as Doris said, my name is Armin Sarah, and I blog at mererhetoric.com. I'm also a PhD student in communication, studying media and communication at USC Annenberg. And so there's a degree to which the two strands that Doris mentioned, the strand of writing about politics, being concerned about what's happening to the country and to the world, to our national security, and to our ability to protect our friends and allies abroad, really does meet my interest in the middle with my academic interest in new media, in how journalism works, and how often the facts that journalists and reporters attempt to convey to their audiences aren't always the most objective. And so this evening for me is particularly exciting in those dimensions. I also wanted to echo, before we begin tonight, the threats to digital journalism, to new journalism, to the things that our panelists and I try to do on a daily basis, the threats that are emerging, both on a regulatory level and on a legal level, because if you take one thing away from this evening, it should be that the mainstream media is falling down on its job, and that new media and new journalists are picking up the slack, but also that their ability to do so is increasingly threatened. And I want to go through three recent examples that really drive this point home before we get to the regulatory environment, just to emphasize why it's so important that citizens realize, A, the value of what's being presented online today, and B, the increasing danger that those presentations are under, and the real possibility that in the future many of those voices might be stifled. So let me go through three anecdotes just real quick. They're not political, but they are setting the stage for what may become political later, and they've all happened, at least two of them have happened, within recent weeks. The first is a decision that came out of New Jersey that had very little to do with bloggers, but the judges took it upon themselves to insert into their decision a finding that said that bloggers simply aren't journalists for the purposes that, for the protections that traditional journalists get. And this is increasingly something that people are aware of, and increasingly something that's being emphasized by certain political factors. The second thing that occurred happened completely off the radar of political journalists and political bloggers. In the Bay Area, the editor of arguably the world's biggest technology site, a guy named Jason Chen, was involved in leaking the new iPhone, and for his trouble was raided by local police and had all of his computers confiscated, in complete violation of California's extremely stringent journalism shield laws. Just happened. These threats have bite. They have legal bite, and they have potentially real long-term consequences. There was an incident at the end of last year. I'm sure everyone in here remembers the Christmas bomber. Immediately afterward, our airline security services freaked out. They issued a ton of new directives to pilots, from turning off in-flight GPS to not allowing passengers who came in on foreign flights to go to the bathroom in the last hour, to not allowing any kind of in-flight communication, as if somebody couldn't figure out when the plane starts to descend. They issued these, and they were supposed to be confidential. Two bloggers leaked them. Both were subpoenaed. Both were threatened with jail time. If they had been recognized as journalists, it would have been the scoop of the month. They managed to obtain internal documents. They just didn't have the same protections that other journalists do. That wouldn't be a problem were it not for the fact that, as we'll explain in a bunch of contexts tonight, traditional journalists aren't doing their job. And so if they were doing their job, maybe there could be some leeway about the degree to which we need protections for new journalists and for digital journalists and for electronic media, but they're not. how will this go down if it goes down? It will be in the context of new regulations being set by the FCC. This happened this week. The FCC is pursuing what might be the laudatory end goal of ensuring that no internet traffic is ever favored over any other internet traffic. It goes under the label of net neutrality. The problem is that the way that they have decided to declare that they have the right to enforce net neutrality is by declaring that the internet is functionally indiscernible from radio. There's a public communications channel. The problem with that is that, as everybody in this room knows, the FCC is not above, during certain political climates, trying to enforce what has gone under the label of the fairness doctrine. The idea that they get to decide which political stance gets how much airtime. So under the banner of equality, they have actually given themselves the power, or intend to give themselves the power. Hearings are ongoing and will begin shortly. Intend to give themselves the power to enforce what might be an internet fairness doctrine. That would be a disaster for anyone who thinks that it's important that citizens have the ability in today's insanely saturated media landscape to challenge the government, to get through the din and the noise that's thrown up by politicians, by corporations, by mainstream media outlets. It would be an unmitigated disaster. And so for much of the takeaway from all of the incredibly in-depth analysis that we'll hear tonight, much of the takeaway from that is that if we want this kind of analysis to continue being available, if we want this kind of investigative journalism that goes way beyond what the mainstream media is willing to investigate, if we want that to continue, we need to be aware of the degree to which it's threatened, and we need to be calling, emailing, faxing politicians to indicate that it's unacceptable that internet media be stifled. Let me give one very, very short example from my experience about where the mainstream media gets out-scooped and out-analyzed. One of my biggest posts, one of my most successful moments as a blogger, as an electronic journalist, happened at the end of last year. And Mark Garlasco is a name that might not be familiar to you. He was an investigator for Human Rights Watch, ostensibly a weapons expert, who was responsible for 3 or 4 of the most damaging anti-Israel reports that were published by Human Rights Watch, which devotes 22%, by the way, of their reports to anti-Israel reports, as if Israel is committing 22% of the world's human rights violations. They're obsessed with the Jewish state. He was at the forefront of several reports during the second half of the last decade, publishing on Israeli anti-terrorism efforts in the Gaza Strip. He published a particularly damaging report on Israel's use of white phosphorus shells and explicitly claimed that Israel had committed war crimes. He also was a bit of a careerist, and the reason that that's important is because he was in the habit of feeding press releases and interviews about his anti-Israel reports to any outlet that would take him, and that was most mainstream media outlets, including several prominent ones that are read very deeply inside the Beltway. That's one thing about him. The second thing about him is that it turns out that for the better part of a decade, he had been an obsessive collector of Nazi paraphernalia. Obsessive. Published a nearly 500-page book that retailed for over $100 on the issue. Has creepy mannequins dressed up with German uniforms and medals in his living room. And this was the guy who was responsible for thousands of small daily decisions that added up to gigantic anti-Israel reports. And I got the heads up about his hobby from another blogger that runs in pro-Israel circles, a guy who blogs at the Elder of Zion blog. And without exaggeration, in 90 minutes, they managed to compile enough information until today He's been forced out of his job by the Human Rights Watch, and this, and I wrote it at the time, the upshot of this is not that this was the result of some kind of hard-nosed journalism. This took an evening of work from an functionally amateur journalist, and I don't say that with false modesty, I mean that, to highlight what a complete breakdown of accountability there was in the mainstream media investigating the kinds of people who regularly participate and lead international efforts to delegitimize Israel. It was a complete breakdown in accountability. That's one of the themes from tonight. The second theme, something to be on the lookout for, is why the mainstream media falls down in these kinds of contexts. And there are different reasons. In the case of Garlasco, I really think what was going on is nobody found his biased and false reports weird, because most of them believed them. They confirmed what they believed. So it never occurred to anyone to ask, given this guy's shameful bias, what's driving it? And I should probably mention that I don't think that the guy is an out-and-out Nazi. I think that he is merely obsessed with that period in history, and we wouldn't let a guy, if you'll forgive a moment of unseemliness, and I also apologize to the folks watching at home, we wouldn't let a guy who's a porn addict investigate sexual harassment claims in a workplace. We let a guy who was a war porn addict investigate the Jewish state over the course of half a decade. It never occurred to anyone to ask, in the mainstream media, to ask why, even though new media and the circle of pro-Israel, pro-Western, pro-American bloggers who seek to defend anti-terrorism efforts were all over this guy. Never occurred to anyone in the mainstream media to investigate. But there are different reasons why the mainstream media sometimes falls down on the job. I think in my case, in the case of Garlasco, it was relatively innocent. I think that in some of the cases we'll hear tonight, there are politicized, deliberate efforts to inject certain frames, certain narratives, certain stories into public dialogue. We've got people who are going to talk about Iran, about the peace process, about the lack of accountability of then-candidate Obama during the last election. And so there are different ways that bias causes failure in different contexts, which is why our panel of experts has a variety of topics that we'll cover tonight. But the underlying need is for different voices, a plurality of voices, a plurality of different motives that all seek to hold different policymakers accountable in different domains. So tonight's bloggers will talk about their specific areas in which they're experts. They'll talk about where the mainstream media has fallen down. They'll talk about where they personally and other bloggers have picked up the slack. And they'll talk about why they view this kind of digital activism, digital reporting, digital journalism, electronic efforts to hold policymakers accountable, why they think that's important. Plurality, a vociferous debate is good. It's under threat increasingly. And the upshot is that all concerned citizens need to be aware of the need to defend against efforts to stifle dissent and to stifle free speech and to stifle different investigative models, and hopefully, by the end, be willing to participate in some of those. On that note, I'll clear the microphone. Rick Richmond will come up next. He is, his home blog is Jewish Current Issues. He blogs at Commentary on their Contentions blog. He blogs at The American Thinker. He's been written up in the New York Sun. He has for years been a tireless advocate of the U.S.-Israeli special relationship, of the need, the diplomatic need, the national security need, the ethical need to maintain a robust Jewish state and to defend American national security. And on that note, here he is.
Doris thought that it might be interesting to you how each of us started out as a blogger. But I don't have a very long or inspiring story to tell you in that regard. I started blogging because basically I misunderstood a remark my wife made to me. Back in 2002, early 2003, she always used to say to me, you read all this stuff and you don't do anything with it. It was only years later that I learned that what she meant was you read all this stuff and you don't do anything with it, so you shouldn't be reading all this stuff. Instead, I took it to mean you read all this stuff and don't do anything with it, you should do something with it, so I started a blog. Back at that point in time, the internet, or particularly email, was being used primarily for the mass distribution of jokes to all your friends. And you would receive, if the joke were even semi-funny, 10 or 20 emails before the end of the day with the same joke, which often wasn't quite that funny, certainly not after the first time. So what I wanted to do, though, was to put out into the public domain what I was reading, what I thought other people should read, but not force it upon them by virtue of emails, but just make it available to them. And I thought then, and I think now, that the most important part of my posts are, in fact, the links. Because if a post is just my opinion or an unsupported statement of fact, then there's really no reason why someone should substitute my opinion for theirs, and there's no reason why they should believe the facts that I'm asserting. So it's the links that are important. And I developed what I call the rule of five, that if I didn't have a combination of points that hadn't been made elsewhere, with links to sources, usually original sources, that hadn't been widely disseminated already. If I didn't have a combination of five of those, I was just engaged in a rant, and I should save it. But if I could meet the rule of five, I would put it out there. And what I was trying to do is not so much a new media versus old media thing, despite the title of our panel tonight. I was trying to incorporate what I actually thought were old journalistic techniques to substitute for some bad new ones that I saw in the mainstream media. And the people I was trying to emulate, having read them, were two: Norman Horowitz and I.F. Stone. And I've made a little bit of history here tonight because that is the first time I'm quite sure that those two names have been used in the same sentence, particularly favorably. But what Norman Horowitz always did was not simply to make his points, but to quote from original sources in the text of his article a paragraph from a document or a statement that supported what he was saying. So you not only had to believe him in order to understand his points, you didn't even have to take it on faith that a footnote that said if you went to the library and found this book and looked on page 287, you could see that this was a true fact. You could see it right in the text of his article. And that's an important thing that blogs can do now that the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, anybody can't do, because you have unlimited space, in effect, with a blog. So you can recreate what was really being done before. And what I.F. Stone demonstrated, particularly during the Vietnam War, when he was publishing I.F. Stone's Weekly, which would have been a blog back then because it was an alternative medium, was that what you needed to know was right out there in plain sight in the form of government documents and statements and statistics that were readily available if you chose to look for them. And what I.F. Stone would do is he would get the congressional record every day, which is about that thick, and he would look through it because people would put in studies, letters from concerned or informed constituents, statistics, reports. It was all there. And he was able, as an opponent to the war in Vietnam, to develop not a rant against the war, but a fact-based case against the war that became very effective for a very influential segment in society. So, not that obviously I'm in the category of either of those, but what I started out doing was reading the New York Times and then comparing it on the internet to the transcript of the press conference or the other event that the New York Times was describing. And the first time I got a post that was linked to Yellow Green footballs and then to Powerline, which then makes it go effectively viral throughout at least a part of the blogosphere, was a time when I read a New York Times report. This was at the time of the Gaza disengagement, quoting or purporting to quote Condoleezza Rice as saying Israel's done X, but they really should do Y. And it was a very harsh quote, particularly since Israel was going through a very difficult process to approve and then carry out the engagement. It was tearing society apart, splitting the ruling party. They had to demolish the homes, civil society, jobs of 8,000 people, move them out. And it was, well, okay, they did X, but they got to do Y. It was a very harsh statement, and it had certain repercussions in Israel. So I got the transcript off of the website of the State Department, and I looked for the quote. And I could find the first part of the quote, but I couldn't find the second. And I kept reading, and I finally found the second, 1,368 words later in the transcript. And so what the New York Times reporter had done was to take 5 words from here and splice them to 5 words over there, with not even 3 dots between them. So I did a post, and that was a post that got circulated, and then the New York Times got a whole slew of adverse reaction, and the White House eventually had to deal with it 2 days later because the statement had caused repercussions in Israel, and it effectively was not a true statement. It was the New York Times misreporting something that I myself could visualize because I could simply pull up the transcript. And it's a large part of what I do today because the White House press conferences by Robert Gibbs are they're informative in a very strange way. The White House press corps has really become almost irrelevant. The last press conference that President Obama held was last July, 10 months ago. That was a press conference where, I won't say he acted stupidly, but he unwisely answered a question about a local police matter involving one of his friends that he probably shouldn't have answered. He hasn't held a press conference, a primetime press conference, since. Instead, he relies on one-on-one interviews where he can more or less control the flow of the conversation, or speeches in front of rallies or other formal presentations. He hasn't held a press conference. If you read the transcripts of the daily White House press conferences, the White House reporters are angry about this. And they are pressing the spokesman in a way that they haven't before. And they're asking the questions that you would want asked, and they're not getting answers. And that itself is significant and needs to be out there. And so last week, there was a report in Haaretz, last Friday, a week ago Friday, in which senior Israeli officials told Haaretz that European leaders had told them that President Obama had said to the European leaders that if the proximity talks, which started yesterday and are supposed to last 4 months, are stalemated at the end of the 4 months, that he would call an international conference in order to deal with the situation. And I had seen that in reports unsourced elsewhere in the Washington Post, Haaretz, one other place, but no real confirmation of it. How could, they don't disclose their sources. But Robert Gibbs got asked the question at the end of a lengthy press conference, and the question was, we understand that President Obama said such and such, is that correct? And Gibbs says, I haven't heard that, but I will check with the National Security Council and see if they've got anything on it. You can't have a follow-up question to that. And figure, well, I'll wait 1 day and see if Gibbs comes back the next day and answers the question. Or if he puts up, as he often does, a statement separately after the press conference that answers a question he was unable to answer. No statement put on the website, didn't come back to it the next day, and And I figure, here's a guy who's got a much better source in the White House than the National Security Council to ask that question of. And he doesn't. And that was sort of the dog that didn't bark. And so you sort of know from that kind of slick and studied almost evasion of the question that certain things are true. So I want to just briefly end by talking about the main thing that I have probably blogged about more than any other issue, which is the 2004 April 14th letter from Bush to Ariel Sharon in connection with the disengagement, which is something that the mainstream media views as a mere policy that wasn't binding on anybody but the prior president, and particularly if it was the prior president was Bush, something that almost by definition was not to be followed. But if you look at, as I did, the actual text of the letter, and then understood that you couldn't understand that letter if you didn't read the letter from Sharon to Bush that Bush's letter responded to, and then if you didn't understand that there were certain terms like defensible borders that had defined and well understood diplomatic meanings that you could follow if you went back through prior letters, because Secretary of State Christopher had used defensible borders in a commitment statement back in 1997 when then Prime Minister Netanyahu had withdrawn from Hebron. And Secretary of State Baker had used that statement in 1991 as an assurance to Israel to get it to go to Madrid to talk to the PLO to start the peace process. And back in 1967, at the time of UN Resolution 242, which is technically the basis of the peace process and the proximity talks, President Johnson had asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff to develop a map of defensible borders, and that's available on the internet. So when you look back at all these references, you can understand that this Bush letter was not just a letter, not just a statement of policy, not just a statement by one president that need not be followed by another, but a deal with Israel in exchange for the Gaza disengagement, reflecting a commitment that goes all the way back to 1967 and had been supported by each administration since. The reason I call your attention to this is that in connection with the proximity talks and the possibility, and I would say probability, that they are not going to go anywhere, not anywhere far, and that the next step will be an international conference based on a U.S. plan. That U.S. plan can be either whatever the Obama administration thinks up, or it can be a plan that recognizes defensible borders, as it should, not only because defensible borders are important, but because there was a U.S. commitment that the U.S. through the President should not be able to simply disregard. So I'm going to read to you one sentence from the 2004 letter. And the first part of the sentence is the same sentence that both President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton repeat all the time. They say, the letter says, and they say, the United States reiterates its steadfast commitment to Israel's security. That's what they say all the time these days. And the sentence stops there, and so you don't know what that means. But this letter provided the context, including secure, defensible borders, and to preserve and strengthen Israel's capability to deter and defend itself by itself against any threat or combination of threats. And that last reference to by itself is a coded reference to any unacknowledged methods or weapons of self-defense that Israel had. And so the United States committed itself to not the 1967 borders, but defensible borders, and not to go down a road that would lead to disarmament of Israel, but in fact to support its retention of the weapons necessary to defend those borders once they were set. That's going to come up in 4 months when we, I think, have a U.S. plan, and there's going to be a debate about what the text of it is. So it is something that probably only the new media will be following, because the old media will treat it just as a letter that simply can be changed. So with that, let me turn it back to Omri.
Next up, we've got Jay Dyer. Her home blog is The Optimistic Conservative. She also blogs at Commentaries Contentions blog. She blogs on Hot Air's Green Room. And she is, among other things, a former naval intelligence analyst who will be talking, I imagine, about issues related to that.
Okay, how's that working for you? Everybody hear me?
Loud and clear.
All right. First of all, my apologies for being late this evening. It was the fault of your traffic. Thank you very much. I do apologize for that. As Omri said, I'm a retired naval intelligence officer, and I retired in 2004. My last deployment was in Iraqi freedom and enduring freedom on the USS Nimitz. And in 2007, the Iran NIE was put out, the one that came out in December and was basically a big lie to the American people in the world. And that is really what got me started on the blogging path. The day after that came out, I had found the NIE on the web, I read it, and I had to tell somebody how wrong it was, so I called the Rush Limbaugh show. And they put me on immediately, since I was a retired naval intelligence officer. And after that, I realized how important it's going to be in the future, seeing the community that I came from do something so utterly egregious. It was a soul-searching moment. And I realized that people who know how to analyze things that the rest of the world doesn't look at very often should make their expertise available if they're in a position to do so. And that's basically why I got into blogging, and it's why I do it now. I supplement that with a lot of opinion about politics and so forth, but kind of the core theme of my blog is looking at what's going on in the world and analyzing it from a political, geopolitical, and military perspective. I did want to cue on a couple of things that Rick and Omri had said. Omri mentioned the bloggers who were subpoenaed because they had leaked information about new airline regulations. Anyone here who remembers James Risen, the New York Times reporter, who leaked the information about the NSA wiretapping program several years ago? He has yet to be prosecuted because he is a journalist, quote unquote, so he can hide behind the journalism shield law, something that bloggers can't do, but I think we might say that from a national security standpoint, what he leaked was somewhat more important than what these bloggers leak. So that was one thing. The other was that Rick mentioned links. Links are very, very important. It's really important to me to put links to basic information, frontline information in my blogs, and this is from my intelligence background. Let you know what I know, what I don't know, what I think, and which is which. And that comes directly from the directive of General Colin Powell. That's what he used to tell his intelligence briefers. And that's something that our old mainstream news media don't do anymore. When you read, you can kind of pick up a code that maybe they just think this is an opinion. They don't necessarily know it, but it's gotten really hard to distinguish between what they actually know, what they don't know, what's just their opinion, and what's a theme or a story that they're trying to put out there. So I'd like to just give you a couple of examples. Something that is particularly important is that bare facts, sometimes they report those, sometimes they don't, and there are great bloggers out there challenging them on the facts, making them report things that they should, and retract when they've gotten the facts wrong. But another big gray area where stories go off in the wrong direction is analysis of what's going on. A recent one of those where my blog got some attention and even forced a group called ISIS, Institute for It's a scientific and intelligence institute, and one of the things they look at is the Iran nuclear problem. They look at North Korea's as well. And information came out a few months ago that Iran's centrifuges weren't working very well. So what everyone was saying was, oh, this means that they're having problems, they're not moving as fast as we thought they were. Maybe we don't have to worry about this quite so much because the centrifuges are breaking down and they aren't getting fixed. And what that meant was that their output of enriched uranium was dropping. It dropped between 2008 and 2009. The problem with that analysis, which you wouldn't see if you just read the New York Times or the LA Times or the Washington Post, was that over on the side there was something else going on. Something huge, eye-catching, incredible, and Bloomberg, a Bloomberg blogger, was the one who picked up on this and put it out on the web. During the same time frame that they were letting their centrifuges stop working and their uranium output dropped, this is what the IAEA inspectors were saying, Iran was mining uranium faster than they'd ever mined it before from their own mines. But that uranium wasn't going to the sites that the IAEA inspectors are able to get into. No one knows what happened to that uranium. The only thing we know is from commercial imagery overhead that tons and tons of uranium they started mining it at the same time that their output dropped at these sites that the IAEA visited. Well, an intel analyst would look at that and say, gee, they're putting all the effort in secret sites inside of mountains, the ones we haven't seen, because they've got to be doing something with that uranium. And they've got these centrifuges that they're just letting break down here, but their new centrifuges work a lot better. When they brought the new centrifuges online, they were working great, and their output started ramping back up. So were they in fact just having trouble with their uranium and we don't need to worry about this or being slowed down, or are they in fact moving faster and they've got it off in secret facilities where we can't see what's going on with it? I think the latter is much more probable given the totality of what we know about Iran. And ISIS actually had to come out and do an assessment of that question because my blog post prompted so many pingbacks and other blog posts coming in and saying, hey, this is a good question. We need the answer to this question. ISIS didn't have a good answer for it. The bottom line is the IAEA process is utterly irrelevant. We don't know how much uranium Iran has and how much enriched uranium they have. We have a count from IAEA, and then we've got all this other stuff that we don't have a clue. So the complacency that's induced in the public mind by these poorly analyzed pieces of information coming out is, that's the kind of thing that it's really important to combat. Another thing, recently we had the Scud missiles given to Hezbollah by Syria. And right at the same time that happened, it turns out General Paul Vallely, many of you have probably seen his Pajamas Media video. He came out and said that a Russian submarine had visited Beirut. It was during the same time frame. Well, I looked at that and thought, I really don't think a unit of the Russian Navy went to Beirut. For one thing, the only one that could credibly fly an Iranian flag, which is what had been reported, and it sounds to me like it came from Israeli intelligence, would be a Kilo-class diesel submarine. And the Russians couldn't put one of those in the Mediterranean without it being detected somewhere. What I believe happened is that Kilo was built by the Russians for the Algerian Navy is the one that went to Beirut. And that just opens up a whole amazing realm of possibilities about what's going on if Algeria is involved in delivering possible WMD chemicals or toxins or something like that to Lebanon. Then there is a wider scope of what the threat is and who's involved than anyone that in the mainstream media is really thinking about out there. What's amazing is if you look at today versus 40 years ago, even 30 years ago, 40 years ago, members of the news media used to have the background, the knowledge, the interest to dig out these facts themselves and bring them out to people. I mean, when I was a kid, in the 70s, you could read information and analysis like this in the regular media. And now, you don't get anything from them but Obama talking points. That's all we get every day. So it's extremely important that we have a lot of bloggers out there bringing out this kind of information. One of the things I was telling the guys last night is that Algerian Kilo story was put together by an Algerian website. Someone from their Navy had posted video of their submarine workups in the Baltic Sea from January of this year. And that video was emailed to that individual by someone from the Russian Navy, who was the one who took the video on board. And this was in an Algerian blog forum. It was just a bunch of commenters going back and forth, and one of them posted a video. That's the kind of thing that's out there. Other information came from a French guy, he's a former retired French submariner, and he likes to keep up on all the submarine news in the European theater. That is the power of the web, the information that's out there that you can just reach out to sitting at your desk, and you don't have to pay anything beyond your internet subscription fee for it. So that's the kind of thing that is particularly important that we keep available to people, that it not be regulated out of the realm of possibility for folks, so poor people don't have to pay extra to get to the Fox News site or political blogs or something of that nature. I have one more item, and I can't quite remember it, so you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to wrap it up. And if you ask a question about it, then it'll be important to talk about. But that's what blogging means to me, and those are some of the things that have been particularly important in the way I like to present information. So thank you very much.
Next up, we've got Daniel Greenfield. He blogs at Sultan Niche on a daily basis. He has been syndicated across the country and is a widely acknowledged writer on the question of the way that American politics overlaps with Jewish politics, overlaps with Israeli politics. Daniel?
Thank you. It's great to see you all here. I know some of you in person on the internet, and others I look forward to getting to know in the future. For the question of how I began in new media, the answer is the New York Times, the Sunday New York Times. I don't know how many of you have seen the Sunday New York Times, but it is a beached whale of a newspaper. It weighs several pounds. It has millions of words and multiple sections. Film, TV, Gold, Metro, International, Sports, Vice, and tables, chicken legs, and a special pull-out on Zimbabwe. It is the epitome of the newspaper. It's the epitome of their journalism. And once upon a time, I used to read that Sunday New York Times from end to end. And I think that is the greatest tribute possible to the long-dead dinosaur media journalism that has now passed away. Jews in particular, for many Jews in New York, the New York Times is a new Bible of sorts, and not just in New York, and not just the New York Times, but that kind of newspaper. We are the people of the book, and we love words. And when you look at Sunday, and the Sunday New York Times, you can see why. It's bigger than the Bible, it has more words than the Bible, and we love words. Even when they're hateful words, they're actually directed at us. Now, why am I talking about the New York Times? Doris, in her opening remarks, mentioned never again. During the Holocaust, what was the New York Times printing back then? When 70,000 Jews were gunned down, it buried it on page 19. When 300,000 Jews were murdered, it buried it on page 24. There are entire books and a series of articles written about the deliberate suppression of news about the Holocaust by the New York Times. It wasn't only the New York Times, but the New York Times was the most notorious of those examples. Now, why was this going on? Because the FDR administration thought that talking about the Holocaust would hurt the war effort. The reality was somewhat more complicated, but that was the reason. And so the New York Times buried the Holocaust. Now, this is not just about the past, it's also about never again, which is today. Today, the New York Times is also burying the murder of Jews. It's burying the terrorist atrocities committed against Jews. It's burying the violence committed against Jews in Europe. There's a pattern there. And the pattern is repeating itself again. Now, this is about old media versus new media. This is what old media does. There was no new media during the Holocaust. But you had the people taking out advertisements saying that the Jews of Hungary could be saved for a certain amount of dollars per person. That was the extent of new media back then. Today, we have more options. Today, we have people who can step out and talk about the threats to Jews. Today, we have a challenge to old media. So when the New York Times buries a story of Islamic terrorism, there are new bloggers who will take it up. So when the New York Times buries a story on Obama's ties to Muslims and to anti-Israel radicals, there are new bloggers who will pick it up. And that's what happened during the campaign. The key point is for people to actually read and listen to what is going on so that they're heard. I was at a pro-Israel rally a month ago. Three of the speakers at the rally said that they voted for Obama. And they said that they now regret it. What they should have really regretted was that they did not read what was being printed in the new media about Obama. Just about everyone here at the table, I believe, has written about this. I've written about this. Obama's ties to Rashid Khalidi, Obama's anti-Israel advisors. The list of them is virtually endless. Samantha Power, who talked openly about invading Israel. The press told us first that it wasn't a big deal. Then they told us that she was gone from the campaign. We'd never have to worry about her again. Now Samantha Power is the director of the National Security Agency Council. She has a position that was specifically created for her. In 2007, I wrote about James L. Jones and his anti-Israel bias. Today, James L. Jones is the #2 man in foreign policy in the Obama administration. And recently, James L. Jones was caught making an anti-Semitic joke. He wasn't caught by old media. Old media had no interest in catching that kind of thing. He was caught by a new media blogger, Gilbert Flip. Again, you could not revisit old media. What you could read at old media were the excuses for it, the justifications for it, the whitewashing of it. And that is a pattern. During the campaign, I did research into Obama's ties to radicals. For example, his three closest clergymen, Jeremiah Wright, I think you know of him, Father Flager, he's a little more obscure, but I was the one who actually wrote the story about him, and Willie Barrow. All three of these people were heavily tied to Farrakhan. They had defended Louis Farrakhan. They were friends of Farrakhan. The only time the media covered this was when they were forced to cover this, was when they were given a video to cover it. Now you can understand why the LA Times has suppressed the video of Obama at the Rashid Khalidi dinner. Because when there's a video, you have to cover it. When there was a video of Jeremiah Wright, they had to cover it. When there was a video of Father Flager, they had to cover it. If there was a video of Obama with Rashid Khalidi, they would have to cover it, which is why they're burying it. But this is the power that new media has. It was not old media that talked about this, it was new media that brought it up, and that has kept bringing it up. Ed Koch, who actually campaigned for Obama, he went out and campaigned for him. He dismissed all the statements about Obama as email campaigns by right-wingers. This was, by the way, the same line used by Obama, was the same line used by the media. Now they dismissed all this, he dismissed all this, now he's writing that he weeps. He shouldn't be weeping, he should be reading. If he had read this to begin with, he wouldn't need to weep. And this is the basic problem here. And that is the major problem, and that is the biggest argument for new media, a free press. Right now, the new media is the best hope for a free press. Honestly, it's about the only hope for a free press right now. Because the main networks, the mainstream media, all voice one single view. Now, some of you might be thinking about Fox News, that Fox News is different. Fox News is not necessarily different. And if you look at what's going on, Rupert Murdoch is not going to live forever. And when Rupert Murdoch does die, his successors, his sons, his son-in-law, these are people who are those who hate Fox News, who think that Fox News is dragging down their reputation. So if you're counting on Fox News for the future, it's not going to be there. It's either new media or it's nothing. There's a very simple agenda here at work. The old media is dying. Its overhead is too big. It has no real future. ABC News has fired 700 staffers, I believe. CBS News has fired a large number of staffers as well. A lot of these newspapers are being sold every day, and the biggest obstacle to selling them is finding someone who will pay even a fraction of their value. Right now, even Newsweek is on the block. You go into the foot at 5 years ago, now Newsweek is on the block. And now here's the really amazing thing. Imagine that somebody tried to compete with GM and Ford, and they began making cars in their own garage. And they take welders and they take pieces of sheet metal and they start building cars in their garage, but then suddenly they're selling more cars than GM and Ford. We have people at this table who can do that. We have people at this table who have done that, who have more page views, who have more traffic, who have more readers than major newspapers, without the overhead. So new media is winning. But what happens when an industry is in danger? What happens is that they try to regulate you out of existence. And that is what is going on now. The biggest argument has been that they are real journalists, we are not real journalists. They are professionals, we are not professionals. You know, that argument might have flown in the 50s, it does not fly today. Because there's no such thing as professional journalism anymore. What there are people who are trained to repeat talking points, who are trained to say the safe things, who are trained to say what the administration says. Now, sometimes they get frustrated, sometimes they lash out. Dana Bilmack in the Washington Post, for example, wrote a column a few weeks ago where he compared Obama to a dictator for controlling the press. There's no need to report, it's a momentary frustration, because they do know their roles, and their role is to repeat the talking points. They can't stray too far from that. There's a lot of anger and frustration, as Rich spoke about. There's a lot of anger, but they can't go too far from that role, because in the end it's all they have. What they are now is not investigators. They don't investigate, they don't report, they don't fact check, except when it comes to political enemies such as the Republicans. What they do is repeat what they're told. And that's not a free press. That is a propaganda press. To have a free press, you have to have a diversity of opinions. Now, during the 2008 campaign, Jews relied on the old media. They listened to what the old media said. They listened to what the New York Times said. They listened to what the LA Times said. They listened to what CBS News said. They listened to what CNN said. And what they heard was, Obama is great on Israel. Obama is a really good guy. All this stuff is a smear campaign. Don't listen to it. Don't pay attention to it. And now we have people showing up at pro-Israel rallies going, well, I voted for Obama. It was a big mistake, but how can I know? Well, new media is how you can know. The people at this table, including myself, have worked very hard day after day to bring this out into the light. They've tackled issues, they've tackled Obamaism, they've tackled Obama in a number of different areas. And they do this work every day, some with pay, some without pay, because they really care about the truth. And that was what journalists used to care about. Today, journalists don't care about that anymore. Today, journalists care about being politically correct. They care about conforming. That makes them no different to North Korean or Russian journalists. That's not how our concern. And that is why new media is fundamentally important. When I worked to bring out the story about Father Flager, the media eventually picked it up because they had to. But somebody had to be there first. The story had to be out there for them to actually pay attention to it. Because the media only pays attention to negative stories when they are forced to cover them. When there's a video, when there's enough broad reach for it, then they will finally cover it. And then they will act as if they're doing you a favor by finally covering it. But all they're doing is that they're finally belatedly doing their job months later because they were forced to do it. And you've had this on numerous issues. Now, do we have an agenda? Of course we have an agenda. Everybody has an agenda. Human beings have biases. The media has always been biased. But there's a difference between a human being who has biases and that is pure propaganda. Now, let me use an example for that. Henry David Thoreau, writing about corruption in government and injustice in government, he said that a government has a certain amount of corruption and injustice, just as anything, a machine has a certain amount of friction. But when the injustice and corruption takes over, then friction has its own machine. With the media, friction now has its own machine, or bias has its own media, and you have a propaganda press. And that happens when there isn't a lack of balance, but there is just a repetition of one point of view over and over again. Now, that might be done with the best of intentions. A lot of people get into journalism because they believe that their mission is to bring down evil right-wingers, just like Bernstein did. They saw the movie, they liked Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman, and they decided we want to go to J school and we want to do this. So their motives might be benevolent, but they're not reporters. They have an agenda, and we have an agenda. But the difference is, as Rich again pointed out, and as Jennifer pointed out, we show our sources, we show our links. For example, when they came to Ezekiel Emanuel, Rav Emanuel's brother, that's a lovely family, by the way. Now, during the Obamacare debate, a number of articles by Ezekiel Emanuel came out where he talked about triage, where he talked about the private people of medical resources based on what contribution they could offer to society, whether we should save a funeral director first or a nurse's aide first. And all this stuff is very creepy. It goes to the death panels question, and it disturbs a lot of people. So right away, the Time magazine came out with a whitewash. They did an interview of him where he talked about how hard it was being summoned back from the Alps. He was vacationing in the Alps. He was hard at work vacationing there. They summoned him back. Time magazine did a really sympathetic interview with him. They used precisely one sentence from one of his articles. They did not link to the original article. What I did was I linked to the original articles. And then I gave the quotes. I explained them, but I linked to the original material. And if you wanted to, you could see the full articles and you could see what he had written. And that's different. Time magazine did. Time magazine linked to their own stories about Ezekiel Emanuel within the article. So if you wanted to do that, you could follow Time magazine's links to Time magazine and read about Time magazine, writing about Time magazine, about Ezekiel Emanuel. This is normal for the mainstream media. And this is the difference between the new media and the old media. We don't always get it right. We're not perfect. We're human beings. But with us, you can check our work. You cannot check the work with the mainstream media. And that is why we represent a guarantee for the free press. We represent a guarantee for the First Amendment. And the First Amendment is under attack. Jews, in particular, have all too often given their allegiance to information sources that make them seem wise and educated and smart, like the New York Times again, but that don't have their interest at heart. They don't even have their survival at heart. And that is a major issue that goes to the never-again question. It goes to the never-again question in Israel right now, where a madman is trying to build a nuclear weapon in order to destroy Israel. It goes to the towns and cities in Europe, to London and Paris, where Jewish communities are being pounded out of existence. It goes to right here, where the Fort Hood massacre, the media's first response is to say that he had some sort of post-traumatic stress disorder, like a proxy. He picked it up while he was working. He didn't wash his hands, and he picked up post-traumatic stress disorder. So you're laughing, but the media kept claiming this for around 2 weeks. They kept claiming that anyone who didn't believe this was an Islamophobe. Now again, we had the Times Square bomber. What was his cause? Why didn't he do it? Because it was a Muslim terrorist? No. Yes, that's right. They took his house, and so he waited around for a while. Then he went to Pakistan, and he wanted to set up a bomb in Times Square. Makes perfect sense. He was angry with Bush for taking his phone. It's funny, but on another level, it's actually horrifying because this is the consistent whitewashing that goes on.
He also didn't like Obama.
No, he just didn't like Bush. No, he was fine with Obama. Everybody likes Obama. Everybody likes Obama. If he was white, then it was possibly because he didn't like Obamacare. If he's a Muslim, it's because he didn't like Bush. That's the media narrative. You have to stick to it, or you get kicked out.
Just as there are categories of Jews
This shows us what is on the line. Survival itself. Survival for Israel, survival for America. And that begins with freedom. The freedom to speak out. The media interest is not in the survival of Israel or in the survival of America. Their interest is in the survival of political correctness. They care more about political correctness than they do about their own survival, about the survival of their countries, but all about the survival of Jews in general. And the next time I go to a protest or rally, I don't want to see people telling me that they voted for Obama. The new media is out there. It's time to start reading it. It's time to start supporting it.
Next up in batting cleanup, we've got Jim Hoft. He founded and wrote the blog Gateway Pundit before he got poached to write for First Things, which is a new media clearinghouse on the center right. He also has a radio show in St. Louis. He talks there once a week, and he banned me from bragging, but the joy of having an open mic and a live stream is that I can get away with this. He was recently ranked as the third most influential conservative blogger in the new media landscape, and on that note, I'll hand you over to him.
Better raise this a little bit. Hi, everybody. I'm really honored to be here tonight, very honored, and I'm also honored to be with these fellow bloggers up on this panel. I have a lot of information I want to share with you, and so I'm going to follow some notes, but maybe not so much. What I first thought I'd talk about is what exactly is a blog. I know some of you probably don't even, I should say don't even, but you're not familiar with what a blog is. And a blog is actually, it's a way that any person in the country or the world can go out to the internet, go to a website like Google, sign up, get a little bit of information, and start writing an article. Whether you want to write it about pets or karate or politics or space or whatever your interest is. And you can put a post up every day. It's called a post when you write an article. And what is different about the blogs and what has changed the landscape in media is the fact that everybody can comment then, generally. People can put their own thoughts at the bottom of the article. And so what you do is you build a community, and you build readers, and it's obviously changed the landscape of American media. As far as myself, I started blogging in late 2004, early 2005, and when I first started blogging, I would call my twin brother and ask him if he read my post I put up for the day. And then I'd beg him, and then I'd ask my best friend if he read my post. And that's how it started. So I had 2 or 3 readers a day, and today I have 50 to 60,000 a day average. I have 1.8 million readers a day. But it started out just like, with a lot of things. It was just me, and I developed my skills over time. I've developed my investigative techniques. I have some great tips that I get from readers today, and I've been able to break some great stories, and I hope to mention a few of those tonight. What really got me going with blogging was the fact that back in 2004, before the election, there was this story, and the mainstream media was promoting this story where Dan Rather was going to come out with new evidence about George W. Bush and during his military days. I mean, how long did they have to look at that story? And they said they had some new information. Well, when they came out with this story, Dan Rather pulled out these documents that said, I'm not even clear, I forget what the documents actually said, but it was damning information against George Bush. Well, the next morning, and that really isn't important what they said. What's important is the next morning, in 2004, it was the first time I found blogs. I didn't even know they were there. It was by accident that I found blogs. I was out reading some conservative website, and I was like, gosh, I really want more information. Because it seemed like the conservative media, the websites I was going to, they were telling me something, it just felt like truth. And I think we know when we found truth. I believe I know when I find a place that's telling me the truth. I wanted to find more, and I started looking around, and I found Instapundit and Powerline and Little Green Footballs at the time that was conservative, and and Polypundit, and some of these other big blogs at the time, and it was amazing, the information they were given. Glenn Reynolds, who is from Tennessee, and he's a law professor there, he blogs today. He's been blogging since 2001, and you know, when the 9/11 disaster struck in 2001, he wrote about it that day, and he nailed it, and he nailed what we had to do, and we had to go fight this group, and he said it was Osama bin Laden, he just knew who it was. That's Glenn Reynolds. Today he has 500,000, 500,000 people who read his blog every day. That's a lot of power and influence coming from one person in Tennessee. That's more than most mainstream media outlets. Anyway, so the next morning I was at work, and somebody started writing, somebody tipped me off saying that they were writing about these documents that Dan Rather had reported on the night before. And by noon, what happens with blogs is everybody can contribute. And so all these different experts had contributed information that by noon, within 3 hours, these documents were bogus. They were frauds, and it was a convincing argument they had that these documents were bogus, and Dan Rather, that was in his career, and that was one of the reasons that George W. Bush won in 2004. And that was fantastic, and it was exciting because it was something different. I've never seen anything like that. It just blew my mind, so then later on I started my blog. Currently my blog is listed as the number 8 political blog on Wikio rankings. And that's with the mainstream media blogs. They throw them all in there too. The New York Times, Washington Post, Fox News, CNN. And so mine ranks number 8, so I'm ahead of obviously a lot of those media organizations and their blogs. I'm very proud of that. And I'm liberal blogs too. So I'm number 8 in the country, and I'm just one guy in the middle of Missouri. You know, it's really kind of blows my mind sometimes, and I'm very proud of that. I don't mean to brag, but I want to tell you where I'm coming from. I'm the number 2 most trafficked news website in St. Louis, Missouri. So within a few years of all of the news media, the TV channels, the different magazines, weekly magazines, and different papers, there's one paper, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which has been around for 125, 130 years, maybe longer, and then I would be next as far as traffic goes. So that is unusual today. We're seeing that a lot across the country, that blogs have an incredible amount of influence over the population. So a few points I'd like to discuss briefly, why blogs are so powerful and successful. This is what I think is funny. When, you know, a few years ago, when blogging first started, the media was making fun of all the blogs, right? They're like, oh, those cute little blogs. You know, now they all have blogs, right? So it's like they've come the whole gamut around to where they all have blogs now, and if they don't, it's very unusual. And the news media outlets that started with blogs they're generally a step ahead of the other news media outlets today. A great tip for a media, if there's anyone out there who's a reporter or works for a news service, the best thing they could do today is to hire a conservative blogger, I believe. They've done this in Australia. Their 2 top blogs work for newspapers, and it's incredible because they bring in hundreds of thousands of readers, okay? If the media outlet didn't want to die, they could hire a conservative blogger, right? But will they? No. It's doubtful. But it would be a great strategy if they really wanted to survive. And they'd also bring in all those conservative readers. Can you imagine? What a great... I just gave a great tip to somebody, if somebody wants to listen to that sometime. Glenn Reynolds wrote this book, again, Instapundit, and he called it An Army of Davids. And the benefit of a blog is that you can have a story come out, and you can have all these different blogs give information and break information and put together a story it's something that's never really been done. So it's a group of experts who can come together and figure something out. And that happens quite a bit on the blogs, and it's very exciting when it does happen with a story. Why are blogs critical for America today? Because they fact-check the Democratic media complex. A great example of this recently was during the Obamacare, the mess in Washington that was going on. We all saw on the media how those congressmen from the Black Caucus walked across campus in Capitol Hill, and they got to the other side, and they said that they were called the N-word 17 times by 17 individuals, and they were spit on, and it was the most horrible racist bunch. The crowd was so angry. Of course, we've been hearing these reports all year about how angry these mobsters and these Nazis, were these Tea Party animals. These old ladies with signs, right? So the media, of course, when that story came out within an hour, I think 100 different media outlets had reported it already. But the wonderful thing is, today everybody's a journalist, and everybody can bring a camera with them or a cell phone with a video option. And what happened was several people filmed that incident of those members of Congress walking across from building to building. And you know what they found? Nothing. They found nothing. And it embarrassed the state-run media so bad. And what is great is that we have people today, somebody like an Andrew Breitbart, who is a phenomenal critic. He would not let this story die. The media, of course, if they write something that's bogus, they want you to forget about that. They're moving on to something else. Andrew Breitbart would not let this story die, and he talked about it in every interview, and he got in their heads, and it was just magic to watch. The media, like 3 weeks later, they're saying, well, maybe they didn't, maybe they weren't spit on, but we still think maybe something happened. Maybe we'll look at this again sometime. But he wouldn't let it go, and it was obviously a fraud. The story was just completely bogus, and the media was caught. They were caught. And I think every time that happens, what we're doing as freedom-loving people is that we are building a critical mass. And one of these days, a critical mass of people is going to understand that our media is so biased and many times anti-American and anti-Israel and anti-Jewish. And we will all understand that a new movement in this country, and that will be a wonderful thing for America, and hopefully it comes soon because it's going to save America. What the media has done this past year and a half has been just tragic, pitiful, disgusting. The reporting they've done, the omissions they've made, it's been incredible. I've been blogging, like I said, since 2005. I've never seen anything like it the past year. And I think, too, what is amazing is that it's more evidence than ever. Our media is so left-wing that they see everything that this administration does, that Barack Obama does, they think it's perfectly normal. Right? They have no idea that 60 to 70 to 80% of the people cannot believe what's going on. But of course, if they're that far left, they just think it's normal behavior, and that these are great policies, and that everything should be run by the government. So that tells you where the mainstream media is today, and it will be their demise. I went on a trip to Prague. In 2007, I was invited as a blogger to Prague. And there was a wonderful conference there. It was about democracy and freedom, and George Bush came and spoke. And Václav Havel was there, and Natan Sharansky, and the former Prime Minister of Spain, Jose Maria Aznar. They put this together. It was amazing. They had dissidents, people from all these countries who had been persecuted under a regime, had come to this conference. And George Bush was the first president ever to go meet with dissidents, make a special trip to go meet with dissidents. And he gave this wonderful talk on freedom. And for me, that's what America really is about. It's about freedom and liberty. And I understand people have different feelings about that. But for myself, I'm very strong on freedom and liberty. And he gave this wonderful talk. And the sad thing was, a lot of people are still stuck in these old paradigms. The Bush administration dragged with them across the Atlantic Ocean, dragged this pitiful bunch of reporters, the White House bunch of reporters, right? And of course, when I saw them walk in the room, I knew what the mainstream media outlets were going to report that day. What they reported on were the 20 anarchist kids outside running around with, crazy signs and getting arrested. And said nothing barely about his talk. It was just so sad. And how many times have we been lied to? Think of that. We have no idea. We have no idea. Here he was standing up for freedom, and he spent time with these dissidents and shook their hands and gave them a hug, and it was just heard nothing about it. So it was pretty sad. But when I was there, I also went to the former communist headquarters in Prague, and today it's where Radio Free Europe is, and Radio Liberty, which is pretty cool, the building. And while I was in there, what they told me was that in a lot of these regimes, and I think this pertains to us in America today, I've always blogged about freedom, but I really blog a lot about what's going on in America today because I really believe our freedom is being threatened today. But what they told me in this building was that these people in these regimes, the radio channel there will broadcast in on a certain channel, and what happens is the regime will block that channel, and so they'll have to find a different channel to broadcast into the country and try to spread some words of freedom and hope to these people. They say every time the people in those countries find that channel, every time. Because people want truth, and people will seek truth. And that's why today more and more people are seeking out blogging, and the radio and Fox News is doing phenomenal work because they're reporting some of the truth that isn't being reported by the mainstream media. I thought that was a wonderful story. A couple stories that I wrote, and I don't want to go too long. 2 minutes, okay. One was this past year, Obama had a czar in the White House. He had several czars. One was Van Jones. And he was getting a lot of attention. And one day, one of my readers said, "Jim, did you know that he was a truther?" And sent me this information, and I posted that information on Van Jones. And that commie, anti-American, Bush-hating, Whitey-hating, Jew-hating, crazo, embarrassing so badly, it was like the straw that broke the camel's back, and 3 days later he resigned. And I was really proud to be the first one to find that piece of information, and I'll tell you, that Sunday morning when I'm in St. Louis, and I'm waking up with a cup of coffee, and I see Fox News saying, "Hey, the guy resigned," and we think it was because of Jim Often, St. Louis. I raised my cup for that. So that was a great story. A couple other things. The blogs are, there's so much information that we're not getting. In 2007, I was reporting on the protests in Tabriz, Iran. The people there was a huge uprising, and it wasn't being reported. And what was amazing is today we have the worst thing for a regime today is blogs and Twitter and the internet and cameras and phones with videos. It's killing them. They can't hide their dirty deeds anymore. They can't hide it. And the same goes in Iran and Cuba. Today, my friends who blog about Cuban democracy at Babalu blog, they have a video up, and that's what they say. They say not only do their reports, not only do they out the bad things that the regime does, but when they do blog and they connect to these bloggers who are in these countries being persecuted, the more attention you can give to these bloggers, they believe you're helping save them. Because When there's a person in a country being persecuted, and nobody knows who they are, the regime can take care of them easy. But if everybody in the world knows who they are, regimes are a little more hesitant. And so that's wonderful. I do blog a lot about movements, freedom movements, and I reported the anti-Jew bias in the country is just horrible, and internationally. During the war with Israel and Hezbollah, I was one of the bloggers. The New York Times came out with this horrible photo essay. This poor gentleman had been killed in a bombing blast, and they hardly had time to remove the bodies in Lebanon. That was the caption. Well, somebody sent me an email and said, Jim, something's funny about this. The guy's sweating. He's not dusty. Everything else around is, completely blown away. And by the end of the day, some commenters on the site realized that there were some other photos that went with that. This same guy's running around in the back of these other photos. So they didn't completely lie about this guy being dead. He wasn't dead. But it was a way to make Israel look bad. And they do that all the time. And finally, Daniel, who gave a great talk earlier, he mentioned Rashid Khalidi. Back in 2008, the LA Times came out with this article, and they wrote this article about Barack Obama. It was really one of the most honest articles we saw in the media at the time. In the early 2008, they said that he was at this party. There was a lot of Jew bashing, I call it, and they were toasting each other, and Barack Obama gave a toast to Khalidi, and some other radicals were there, and they were reading anti-Israel poetry. And they said, and we got this because there was a video. We watched the video. So at the time, I remember that. And a couple of months later, it kind of hit me, they never released that video. And so I wrote about it a couple of times, and then about a month and a half before the election, I called the author of that LA Times article, and I said, hey, what's up with this video? When are you going to release it? Right? And he said, oh, we're done with that story. We're not going to release it. So I made a big stink out of it. And that's what's great. Some other people caught on, and they re-recorded this and linked to it. And so that was like maybe on a Thursday or Friday. By the next Monday, Sean Hannity and some other Fox people were talking about it. By Tuesday, they were talking about it all day on Fox News and stuff. Who always is the leader of these stories like this? Then the New York Times had to report on it. It was getting a lot of attention. And of course, like we heard earlier, their report on the story was that they just excused this guy. Oh, he's not so bad. He was a former PLO, activist or whatever, but he's not that bad a guy. And just, excuse his behavior. But what was cool was that here I am in Missouri, and a couple of guys here, Omri, I think Rich may have been there. By that Wednesday, there's a protest in front of the LA Times, right? And they're marching with these signs, and somebody sent me pictures, and they're carrying signs saying, release the tape. And I just think that's so cool. Because you can be a guy on the sticks, right? And you can stir it up so bad that they're protesting over at the LA Times. And it really, I've had a lot of fun with blogging, and that's a wonderful thing that something like that happens. And I'm glad I can do that because I believe in the cause. And I believe we have a lot of work ahead of us, and thank you all for having me out here today.
We'll go straight to question and answer, and thank you all for staying up with us as late as we are. Folks are circulating with index cards. I see a bunch of index cards being raised. I I assure you that everybody on the panel enjoys pontificating. We will be here for a while.
We pontificate very efficiently, however.
I would say the time pressure was incredible. Anyone.
Are these just going to work at the appropriate time?
Good question. We'll start off with this one. The basic question. If any of you heard President Obama give his commencement speech a couple days ago, he blamed political distraction on, and here I'm quoting directly, Xboxes, iPads, and a bunch of bloggers. I literally expected him to start talking about how the damn bloggers are on his lawn and the kids need to, go away because they and their iPads are ruining things for him. Question: how do you tell good blogs from bad blogs? Any of our panelists? Jump in.
Well, it kind of depends, I think, on whether you're talking about blogs that are just stupid as opposed to blogs that are putting out bad information. If they're putting out bad information, you're going to see a whole lot of circular, like tinfoil hat people all referring to each other. And I hate to name names here, so I'm just not going to do it. But there are definitely some blogs out there like that. They have the U.S. creating the Haiti earthquake and things like that. If you see things like that, that's definitely not a blog to believe in. People who aren't afraid to link to their source material and explain that they have made deductions, even if their source material is something that, doesn't agree with the conclusion they've come to, if they'll go ahead and put it in there and then talk you through the process, that's a blog to stick with. You're going to get honesty from that blog. So that's certainly something to look for.
Jim, what else? Dan?
I think blogs weed themselves out. If good bloggers generally, if they're consistent, if they post things pretty often, if they post factual information, if they source their material, they'll generally be successful, and they can be successful. And if they're clever and have a little snark, that helps. But the bad blogs that steal people's information, that writes bogus stories, that are just attack blogs, they generally, people don't give them that much attention. So it generally handles itself.
Let me take a crack at that. I think one of the indications of a good blog is that it is actually self-edited. One of the things that Daniel, I think, referred to as one of the criticisms of the new media is we're not professionals, we weren't trained, we don't have editors. But we have something that's worse than an editor in that sense, and that's our own reputation. Every time we put something out there, if somebody can prove once that we've made a significant error, then our credibility is gone and our reputation is ruined. So we can't blame it on an editor. We can't blame it on the actual institution. We are the institution. We are the editor. We are the person whose credibility is at stake. And that is a tremendous force for those who take that conscientiously and don't simply want to rant, but inform and convince, is worth 1,000 editors. And that's a significant aspect of the new media that the established media actually does not have.
To go politically neutral for a moment, a good blog provides value to its readers by helping them understand the subject. A bad blog just repeats what other people have already been saying. A good blog actually educates people, not in the condescending liberal way, but in the sense of giving them information and empowering them to understand a topic and to research it on their own and eventually become bloggers. Jim here spoke about becoming inspired to become a blogger by seeing what other bloggers were doing. A lot of people here will have similar experiences than maybe people in the audience who after reading enough blogs will begin blogs. I know some of you already have blogs. That is what a good blog does. It inspires people, it empowers them to become producers of information and news, not just consumers.
It seems like the question that we're getting more often than any other question is some variation or flavor on the question, how do bloggers support themselves? Blogging is a full-time occupation. What do you guys do at night for fun? And or what can people do to contribute and sustain blogs? And before I present this, I'll add the caveat that I don't think anybody at the table, in fact I know nobody at the table, is a full-time blogger. Very few bloggers are full-time blogger. In my context, I'm a student and Mere Rhetoric works entirely on donations. I know that almost every blogger who starts, every blogger who starts, works on donations to some extent or another. And so all of those things are in play. Blogging is a spare time occupation more than it is a full-time occupation. Guys? Do you think that blogging should have a financial aspect, or will it always remain an amateur kind of thing?
Well, there are commercial bloggers out there, people who make a living off of it, so I think the two will always coexist. The marvelous thing about blogging is that you can get into it without necessarily planning to make it your life's work because you have something to contribute. It's a way of contributing. That's really what it boils down to. And
on the left, they get some pretty good funding on the left for some of their political blogs. Huffington Post, after the election, was given $5 or $6 million to help with their website. And so we do see that on the left. I think the politicians advertised more on the left, on the political blogs during the election. And so really the right today, the conservatives are playing catch up. And there's still plenty of people that I run into who still just don't get it. They don't get it. There's people out there who want to help, who have their interests in mind, who believe the same things they believe. And it'd be smart to advertise on these blogs. Think about that. If you have somebody who has 50,000 readers a day, wouldn't that make sense to put your little ad out there if you're running for office? It's not rocket science.
Amazon does it. They're big fans.
Right, and there is an opportunity, and I think opportunities will increase for bloggers to make money.
We're citizen journalists. That means we're citizens first and journalists second, which means we have day jobs first. One of the reasons that we're actually beating old media is because we have low overhead, and we have low overhead because we actually have real jobs. So if we actually turn this into a full-time proposition, eventually we wind up being the New York Times. And we don't want to go that route.
One of the interesting questions, and Jim specifically touched on this to a great extent, is the role that what generally travels under the banner of social media plays in blogging. How much does Facebook contribute? How much does Twitter contribute? How important are videos that go viral? And a number of people, myself included, are interested in how the panelists use those social media resources on a day-to-day basis to do the work that they do. Rick, you want to start?
Well, obviously, I think that social media like Twitter and Facebook are becoming increasingly important. They're becoming perhaps the principal means of redistributing items that appear on a blog, because people can retweet. Someone can put it on Twitter, somebody can retweet it, others can retweet it, and by that process it branches out into the blogosphere. And the same thing with Facebook, which is becoming, I think, perhaps the principal location of staying in touch with those, not only socially that you want to stay in touch with, but politically in terms of people that you want to read. So you look at what's happening to the mainstream media, or the deadwood media, or however it's referred to, you can see that there's a whole revolution in distribution going on. Younger people do not subscribe to newspapers. They don't read them in print. They're only on the net. The distribution of music has taken a tremendous step forward in the last 10 years in the way that it's distributed throughout the society. So I think social media is the next step beyond blogs, because a blog was where you put something out and people come to you and read it. with social media like Twitter and Facebook, it's being pushed out to people so that they can get it more easily.
To pick up on what Rich is saying, the old-time media had paper boys and delivery trucks delivering their newspapers to people's doors. For us, Facebook, Twitter, and various forms of social media are the paper boy delivering things to people's doors, delivering our articles to people's doors. And that creates the infrastructure for us so that we don't need to have the huge overhead, we don't need the delivery trucks, we don't need the paper boys. We have people who share information, who share our articles, whether it's email lists, Facebook, or Twitter. And they're the ones who help us compete with the old media. You're the ones.
Exactly, yeah. Redistribution via tweet is a big thing that gets a lot of your things seen that might not otherwise be. One thing I would say is that the emphasis is on the dissemination of information. It's moving information around. Ideas are what people are picking up. The social aspect, the person-to-person, I haven't found that to be as important in terms of the blogging interaction per se. It's not that I have 100 friends and they're all coming to my blog through Facebook every day. That's not how it's working. So it's not as much a social thing as it is an information dissemination thing. And it's just a tool. I think we probably all use it. I know I sign up for Twitter feeds and that's how I get some information.
What are your regular jobs?
We farm fish.
A lot of farming, a lot of hands-on working of the earth. Good blogs versus bad blogs. A number of issues have been raised. Among them are legitimate concerns about what kids can find on the internet if we legitimize all blogs and can't tell them apart what happens, but also just why is it that it seems so often that disinformation spreads both through the mainstream media and then gets picked up by the blogosphere, and that the conservative blogs, the watchdog blogs, have such a tough time getting through. And I was wondering if any of the panelists have any opinions either about whether this is an institutional problem. Is it just that people aren't reading as much on the right? Why might this be?
I'd like to comment on that. What I have found in the past year, this has been really an exciting development, and I know this is a fact because I've spoken with some people from Fox News personally, and that is that a few years ago, this was not happening, what I'm about to tell you. Today, Fox News is getting a lot of their stories from the blogs. I know that. They're mentioning the blogs on their shows, their top-rated shows, which dwarf the other networks. I know that these same stories are going to Drudge Report. I also know that Rush Limbaugh, who has an audience of, 20 million a day or whatever it is, some phenomenal number, he's using the blogs too. What is happening today is that on the conservative side, in the conservative media, the new media, the true media, the blogs are writing the stories, the radio is picking up on these stories, and so is Fox News. And so if you're following these outlets, you're going to get the information. If you're not following these outlets, you're not going to get it. Let me give one quick example. A couple weeks ago, I was in Quincy, Illinois, at a Tea Party protest. I've been active in our Tea Party in St. Louis. And we're protesting there. Barack Obama's giving a speech. And I'm with a bunch of old ladies and grandmothers. And they have these wonderful signs, and they're wearing red, white, and blue. Well, they called out the SWAT team. Okay? They called the SWAT team on some old ladies. And I'm standing there, and I'm like, I cannot believe this is happening. Okay, well, the story got up on the big government, it got on Fox News, it Rush Limbaugh. So if you follow those news outlets, you would know about this story, which was totally ridiculous. They're treating these women like they're violent, Marxists running around torching things. And it wasn't happening at all. But you know what's amazing is that because of that story was on the true media, the right media, a week later there's a protest in Connecticut. And I'm looking at some of the pictures from the protest there. And one old lady there has, I'm a grandma, don't call SWAT. That was great because she got that from the new media. If you didn't follow Fox News, you never would have heard that story.
Well, I wanted to make a follow-up to that. This is something we were talking about last night. The old media, the only way they're going to die, we may or may not ever be able to force them to carry good stories and be honest and so forth, but it's the money that causes them to die. They have an advantage right now because they move in the channels that they have controlled for such a long time that you buy your way into by, raising your hand and saying, I'm a such and such. I'm a news broadcast corporation, so they can buy a cable channel and they can put out whatever they want on that cable channel. The beauty of the internet is that it's not channelized. You don't have to buy a channel. All you have to do is pay some money to an internet service provider and get yourself some blogging software, and you can set up a blog. So I don't think we want to, as nice as it would be, if we had a filter, if someone finds it commercially viable to set up a filter and, give you only the best conservative blogs, the ones that you want to see, and you want to pay them $5 a month for that, that's great. But I don't think we want to organize this thing the way that television, for example, is organized, because then you're going to have to, put a name on yourself, you're going to have to buy your way in, you're going to have to meet regulatory requirements and so forth. We need to keep the internet, it's been called the Wild West, unregulated, and everybody out there carrying a pistol in his holster. And it is, and it's great. That's the way it should be. And people are just going to have to get used to the fact that you have to do a little digging yourself, but it's better than not having it, because there is truth out there. If it weren't for the internet, there wouldn't be that truth. So, yeah, it's some work, but we got to keep it going.
Pick up on what Jennifer is saying, there are two basic models. One is the centralized model, in which the government or some huge corporation filters everything and decides what's good and what's bad. We know that model doesn't work. We can walk down the street and see that the model doesn't work. Or we can have the freedom model, in which people make their own decisions about what's good and what's bad, and make those decisions for their family. Sometimes those decisions will be right, sometimes they'll be wrong, but they'll be better for it, because they'll be taking control of what they need and what their children need.
It's the difference between a state-managed or regulated economy and a free economy. It is. From an economic standpoint, if the producers have a monopoly and they have control over the market, then you have to consume what they produce. But if you've got alternative sources of media, and you've got, even within right or left stream blogs, choices there, it's the consumer who makes the choice. And if Jim produces what he produces, he's going to get the type of traffic that he gets, as will the rest of us, to the extent that we meet a need out there that is determined by you rather than by us, and certainly not by the government.
The next question was asked by only one person, but I'm going to take advantage of my role as moderator to ask it, because it's my favorite question to bloggers and allows me to geek out over blogging, which is, what are the 3 to 5 sources that you check every morning before you start blogging? For me, it's a couple: Israel Outlets, Hot Air, and The Drudge Report. I'm desperate to know how I should be doing things like the other bloggers.
Well, you should be checking commentaries at least 4th. But I would say certainly Powerline, National Review Online, Instapundit, Lucienne.com, and the 5 of us.
That's right. Yeah, you've named a good group of them. I check news feeds. You can get tailored news feeds that you set up yourself. So that's one of the things I do, because I'm so much about analyzing the news. Commentary, of course. I got to put in a plug for the home side. I like Gateway Pundit. That's one I often check. Town Hall is, don't ever bother with the comments there. It's one of the silliest sites for commenters, but they do have a lot of very good columnists and a good news feed. So Town Hall and Hot Air are a couple of really good ones. Surprisingly, Hot Air, you get a really good sample of the hottest conservative slant news that you're not going to hear anywhere else on the web from there. So they're probably the one that I check the most each day of the conservative news sites.
For me, I've stopped bothering with American newspapers over the last year and a half because it's Obama administration talking points. If you're actually looking for stories that won't be covered in the American press, try the Telegraph. It's a great British conservative paper. It has a lot of interesting stories coming out there. The Guardian, for example, it's left-wing, but they're covering stories that are not being covered by the media, such as the Russia's insult to Biden, for example. Their Spiegel in Germany isn't bad either. In terms of blogs, I check Jim's site daily. Obviously, I also check commentary, but I check a wide range of blogs, both right-wing and left-wing, because sometimes you have to know what the enemy is doing.
Jerusalem Post.
Yeah, Jay Post is good.
And I check generally in the morning when I first get up. I go through email, check Hot Air. I go to Free Republic just because they generally have a list of topics that are being discussed. And if something happened overnight, it's going to be there. I check Breitbart.com, and because they have great videos. Plus, they have big government, all the big sites there. And then I go to Hot Air, Powerline. And one thing I find too is that over the years it changes. You know, I'll get in different moods and check different sites. If there's something going on in Iran, I may check some of the, like Iran Press News has some great information and usually has videos from Iran that will not be in the mainstream media. So it depends on what's going on in the world too.
Foreign news sources, you just have to take them with a grain of salt, but I look at the Russian newspapers, the Chinese Xinhua, I look at them almost every day, because they're reporting things, again, you have to cross-check them with other sources to make sure that they're giving you a good gouge, but they're great. You will not hear the things in the American press.
Indeed, and one of the things you can do now with Google Translate, you can actually read newspapers in foreign languages. The translations may be weak, but you'll often find information that you don't see even when those newspapers have English editions. This is particularly interesting, for example, with Palestinian news sources, which have a very sanitized English version, and then they have the real stuff in Arabic. And Google Translate works on Arabic. Just keep that in mind.
And if you don't want to go through the translation, there are news outlets in the Arab world that quote the Palestinian news sources more exactly when they translate them into English. So I've caught the Palestinians on a number of occasions through the Dubai National, the United Arab Emirates newspaper.
Next question. Did the LA Times...
Yeah, that's good translations.
Did the LA Times ever release the tape? Next answer, no. Should I cancel my New York Times subscription?
Please.
This is an interesting question. On one level, every blogger on this panel will say you got to know what the other side's saying. On the other side, old media won't collapse until old media collapses because they deserve to, and that's going to be money. I'm interested to hear the panelists' ideas on how that balance should be struck. How much do you support old media simply because that's where the news is coming out? They're the ones with access, and how much do you not legitimize them?
Since I've spoken about the New York Times quite a bit, let me take this one first of all. There's a difference between subscribing to the New York Times and selectively viewing some of its stories. Newspapers depend on subscriptions. That is a major revenue source for them because they can't predict when someone will buy something from a newsstand, and internet ad revenues for newspapers are very weak. So if you really must read some stories in the New York Times, I will occasionally check the New York Times for some things, but I do it online. Or I will do it through stories we posted, for example, on Free Republic or elsewhere, to deny them even that 2 cents of ad revenue for me.
I think what's interesting too today is that there's this website, Memorandum, that tracks the top stories that are being discussed on the internet every day. It also tracks, it has what is called a leaderboard, a section of the leaderboard that has the top news sites in the world. And you would think that it would all be the mainstream media, where the stories are coming from that make it into the mainstream news. But what's happening in the past couple of years is a lot of these top news sources on the leaderboard are blogs. The New York Times, of course, is number 1. Washington Post is number 2. But there's several blogs that are in the top 50, including mine, which I'm going to go in there, And that's pretty exciting because they're getting the different stories out on the internet. And that's where people are finding their news. So.
Yeah, I think one of the things, it's just going to die a natural death, I think, is the daily, using it as a pontification platform, which is what New York Times writers do when they write articles. When you write a blog, you're consciously writing for an audience, and you want engagement back from the audience. When you're pontificating from a podium and you don't really care what you get back from them, you put out a different kind of product. And there's, over here you have journals that come out quarterly or monthly or whatever, and they engage your brain in one way, and then over here you have blogging, which is very interactive. And this bit in the middle, where it's not quite the long-term thinking, but it's not as interactive, I think it's just going the way of the dodo. We're just becoming much more interactive in our daily engagement with the news. We don't need someone preaching to us from a podium at the New York Times. When you read a New York Times article, do you know what they're going to say before they say it? Yes. So, why pay money you could write it yourself?
Well, I'll offer a bit of a dissent here. 67 important years if you're a pro-Israel blogger, and you're finding stuff that is linkable, although people would have to actually pay to see the link, but you can be sure that you are linking to something that's not your opinion, that's something that the New York Times reported at the time. And for me, it's been an invaluable resource. So I think to a certain extent they're entitled to be compensated for something like that. Their stock is, I think it's at $10 a share. It was $50 a share 5 years ago. So the market will take care of them without, in due course.
How can citizens either support blogging in general or support specific bloggers? And this has a sub-question, which is a number of people want to know what the 1-2 talking point is when you hear that credible journalists, that mainstream journalists are credible, bloggers can be anybody, therefore not credible. What is the gut reaction that folks should tell to their friends and family members who level these kinds of charges?
Liar.
Mainstream journalists are just people with an opinion writing. That's what bloggers are too. If you find a blogger writing as if that person is covering from the front lines in Afghanistan, when they're actually sitting in a basement in Hoboken, then that's bad. But journalists do the same thing. They go to Israel, they sit in the King David Hotel, and they pretend like they've gone into the West Bank to see something when all they've done is pay a stringer to, bring them back a biased story. Or their Geraldo, that's right, the gold standard. I think the answer is that you need to look at the credibility established by the individual and the people who trust them, because you don't know everybody right off the bat. But if National Review, if Commentary, if Hot Air trusts someone to post something, then they've got an established reputation. And I've seen those organs get rid of people who didn't meet their standard. So they do have standards. But the journalists, basically, they've got more credibility than they should have.
Personally, I haven't seen very many journalists that have impressed me lately, but I've seen a lot of bloggers that have really impressed me. One interesting story, there's a reporter in St. Louis, her name is Jo Matties, and she's been a reporter, and she has this, everybody knows who she is in the area. And what she does is she came up to me after this Tea Party protest a couple of months ago, and she had her little notebook, and she was taking notes, and she thought she had a scoop, and it wasn't a scoop. I had to correct her. And, it was kind of sad in a way, because here she is, this person who's been a journalist her whole life. Her job got cut, so she's with a different little paper in town. I'm sure it doesn't pay her much. And here she is writing notes. And you know what? By the time she gets that published, the story's done and gone. what a blogger can do, and what I will do, is I'll take a video, I'll take pictures, I'll put it up within, I put a picture up tonight of us speaking while we're speaking. So that's the advantage. We have speed, we have photos, and we have very interesting videos. And so it's like a whole media production in one. I take a blogger over a mainstream journalist any day.
Was that making the news or making the news? When you did your report of yourself?
Yeah.
Is it fabricating?
That was just sheer bragging from what I understand.
Fabricating versus reporting.
Right.
Making or making up.
The last question, and this is the question that has to be last because it's inevitably the question that takes the wind out of a room when bloggers go at each other. It's the question that will cause the most dissent on this panel, I think, which is, best guess, what is the source of media bias? Every panelist touched on this in their speeches, either directly or referentially. For me, it's a sociological issue. I don't think that the vast majority of reporters talk to people who disagree with them much. We know that the vast majority of DC reporters are more likely to read the vast majority, are more likely to read the top liberal blogs than they are to read conservative blogs. We know that they're not likely to click through. We know their political inclinations, and we know who they contribute to during campaigns. I think more often than not, it's not a matter of bias or ill will. I just think they don't know stuff. And so they can't smell a scent when it comes down the trail.
There's an old joke of two young fish are swimming through the water, and an older fish comes by, and the older fish says, "Nice water, boys." And the two little fish swim on, and one of them looks at the other and says, "What the hell is water?" And it takes off of a statement that George Santayana once made, which was he didn't know who discovered water, but he was sure it wasn't a fish. Back in the last century, when all of us were listening to CBS, reading the New York Times, and thought we were informed, we were in that same cocoon. We were in that same stream. And it's you only heard about the mainstream media when there was another stream available. It wasn't a term that was coined back when there was only a single body of water. So we were within that sort of biased group because we didn't have the information. They, in the mainstream media, have a certain point of view. Barack Obama, not wholly joking, said last year at the White House Correspondents' Dinner that I know all of you voted for me, and he's right. So there is a certain personality type and political type that gravitate towards both colleges and journalism as opposed to business or other areas. But as long as you have more than one stream, then you will be able to counter the bias, and people will have the ability to form their own opinion.
There's a component to this that's a political component, there's a cultural component, there's an institutional component. And all three of those come together to make one huge rock of bias. The problem with media bias is that essentially you have a profession being transformed into a political profession. Instead of reporting the news, the point becomes to make the news in order to achieve social justice, in order to build a better world, in order to fulfill the liberal agenda, which is done with the noblest of intentions, which in this case is no excuse because you're transgressing your professional obligation. A doctor who, instead of trying to heal patients, instead begins carrying out his political agenda is guilty of malpractice. Media bias means that the media is guilty of malpractice.
I agree with Daniel that it's a combination of factors. One of the big ones I would mention, though, is the lack of accountability. You get away with bias because you're never held accountable. And in a sense, the mainstream media are being held accountable with declining ratings and declining sales and so forth. But a really good way of looking at it is the famous WMD thing, and we will not go into the whole argument here, WMD in Iraq, but for military intelligence, the price of being wrong about that would have been American soldiers or civilians in the Middle East being hit with chemicals, with biological toxins. We didn't think Saddam had nukes. That would have been the price of being wrong. That was the accountability that we were looking at down the road. For the news media, if they're wrong about WMD, what price do they pay? Where's the price? So that lack of accountability never forces them to correct bias. It never forces them to go back and revisit a story and figure out what they didn't know, what they should have known, what they should have reported and put together. It's they really operate on a news cycle. They didn't used to do this. If you go back and look at articles from 35 years ago, it will stun you how analytical they are. Well written, developed. You can actually read through the whole article and not be bored. And today, it's just an assembly of talking points. And it's that accountability that has really become lacking, I think. They get away with everything they do.
I took a multicultural class one time for a day. And what they talked about at this class was that there's targeted classes and there's privileged classes. And they use the example, of course, is blacks growing up in the United States. And, if you're white, you don't understand what a black person has to go through, and I believe that totally. But part of that, too, is they're sensitive to things that maybe we don't see. Maybe they don't get treated well in the store. Well, I get treated well in the store, and so I can't relate maybe to that, but they're more sensitive to it. I believe with our media today, conservatives in our country are the targeted class. Conservatives are the ones that they demonize, that they call them, mobsters and Nazis and radicals, and they call us violent, These old ladies with signs of violent people. They have to call SWAT. What was that?
Mature women.
Mature women. Thank you. They're working from that paradigm. But I really think they don't understand that they don't see, like, they live in maybe certain areas where that's all they know. We're sensitive to it. And I believe what Andrew Breitbart says. He says that they're the minority. And most Americans generally, in a lot of areas, are more conservative than the media today. I believe, and Andrew Breitbart goes ahead and says he believes that the media is 20%. They control the message, and they control the message, and they're 20%. But the thing is, today, there's a new media that's challenging them, and you'll notice how angry they are today. A great example of this was just last week, this Contessa Brewer coming out and being, after they found out it was actually an Islamic terrorist who planted this bomb. I mean, the rest of us, that was our first thought, right? And she was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, it wasn't one of these Tea Party protesters," or whatever she said like that. They're just very angry today because they're being challenged, because they're going to lose their power grip. And thank God they are, and thank God for all the bloggers and for the tips we get for the readers, because that's what we want to do. We want to, save America.
New information being conveyed new ways. That'll wrap it up for us tonight. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you for your support.